In this video, we want to talk about editing our EZShape. So you can see we trace the initial United States, but maybe there's some things that we need to alter and change, and we're going to go through some of those. For example, notice that the way that it looked at Florida and Georgia, it couldn't distinguish enough to separate it. So you might have to do some manual slicing and dicing. Or in this case, it added the Great Lakes, and maybe that isn't a shape that should have been traced. But also you can see that it only traced contiguous lines that it found. So notice that Alaska has not been traced. So we can go ahead and do that. We can zoom in, for example, and click on Auto Trace. And when we click on it, it will go ahead and trace the additional shapes as best as it can determine. There may be other shapes, for example, if I go on Auto Trace and I click on Hawaii and it traced that, maybe I want to click on Auto Trace and grab another island, and I may want to go ahead and leave them separate, or in Alaska's case, maybe all of these shapes are supposed to be merged. So we're going to show you that next. So in this case here, if I went down and I highlighted this entire area of Alaska, and I have a bunch of polygons that are traced, when I click on merge, it's basically merging those as one shape, and you can see that down below here these are all highlighted, showing me that in fact they are all selected with a check mark. Now if I go ahead and I want to subtract, what is that implying? So let me go ahead and go back to full extent. It only works if I have an overlapping shape. If I focus on Nevada, for example, and then I go ahead and click on it again just to widen it, just so that I can get it to overlap. I now have Nevada overlapping California and other states. So if I highlight California and highlight with my shift key the bigger shape of Nevada, when I subtract, it's going to go ahead and subtract the stuff that's underneath the overlapping shape. So you can see that in fact it subtracted that out. Do undo, take us back to where we were. Okay, so now if I deselect, what does flatten do? Well, again, flatten involves when you have overlapping shapes. So maybe what I do here is I'm going to kind of cheat and go into node edit just so I can move this shape off of there. All right, so now I'm back in edit. Notice that I have Arizona overlapping New Mexico. If I want to go ahead and I want to flatten that out, I'll highlight both shapes. It'll say get rid of the overlapping situation. So as I click on flatten, you can see how now it got rid of the overlapping of the polygons. Next, we have group and ungroup. That's obvious. If I click group, notice it grouped those two together as one image. If I do ungroup, it now separated them back to their beginning image. Slice. This one, and when I look and I zoom in here on Florida and Georgia, I need to separate those. So initially when I choose slice, when I click on it, watch what it does. It highlights it in red, says choose 2 points on the edges. Now notice the first one shows a little starburst, if you can see that. When I click on it, don't get caught up that this may not be the ultimate shape that I'm doing. I'm just going to divide it into two. I can retrace the shape when we get to node edit. Notice the starburst is on the other side. When I click on it, now those are my two shapes, and so you can see that they're separated. Then we have simplify, and simplify is going to go ahead and deal with the complexity of the nodes. And so in this case here, when we have something that has a lot of different nodes on it, and I'm zooming in, and maybe I want to simplify how the shape was designed, and I focus on this. Simplify is basically just dealing with the outline of how the nodes were designed. Watch what happens when I drag this bar, and you'll see that it changes the shape to something that is not as dramatic. So it's just a very simple outline. Whereas when we're at full scale, it's trying to mimic as many nodes and shapes as it can find, and it adds as many nodes as possible. And then lastly, we have scale. So scale deals with whatever's highlighted and what scale it is, and whether we're locking it the axes and so that the X and Y are tied together. So for example, maybe I want to go ahead and scale Texas to be much larger than it is. When I go ahead and I click apply, you can now see when I close out and do full extent that Texas is now huge. So those are some of the basic edit modes. We're going to also talk in upcoming videos about editing via draw and editing via node edit and view. Those are coming up in separate videos.